Hey everybody, welcome back to Lunchbox Radio. To the Lunchbox Radio podcast, rather. I am Alex, your host. And before we get started, first off, I want to, as ever, apologize for the background noise. Once again, it is the height of summer when I'm recording this, and where I am, it is very hot, and it is even hotter because I have a very highly elevated studio. Like, I can see treetops from the window next to my recording setup. So if I don't keep the AC on, I might pass out, and I don't want to do that. I don't think you want to listen to that. So that's where we're going there. Second off, you might notice that it's not my usual background setting. That is because I recently got the opportunity to go into New York City, and if you're listening to this on the at the time it releases, which is Thursday, I believe the July 3rd. It will still be going on until I believe July 11th. So you have a little bit of time to get in and see a really cool Takashi Murakami exhibit over at one of the two I found out the hard way, Gagosian Art Galleries in New York City, in Chelsea. The one on 24th Street. Not the one on 21st. I made that mistake too, so don't feel bad if that happened to you. But it's worth going in. There's not much of what you would think of as traditional Murakami, although there are a couple canvases of his that are collaborative things with Louis Vuitton, since he has another Louis Vuitton collab, but there are a couple famous Murakami things, but mostly it's his slavish and giant recreations of traditional Japanese ukiyo-e paintings. And it's just a really interesting thing. If you have the chance, definitely go check it out. But if you don't, there are obviously pictures behind me, so you can go check those out. You can also check out the pictures without me in front of them over on my Instagram, of which there's always a link in the description of the podcast wherever you get your podcasts and listen to them. But without further ado, I want to jump into what we're talking about this week, which is a little show from 2025, which weirdly you may not have actually watched because it was in fact over on Amazon Prime, and we'll touch on some streaming stuff kind of up front because I think there's some interesting stuff to talk about there. But the show I'm talking about is Gundam GQuuuuuuX. So let's toss it over to I for a plot synopsis, because it's going to be a tricky one anyway. So I, take it away.
In Universal Century 0079, the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon are locked in a brutal conflict known as the One-Year War. Amid the chaos, the legendary Zeon ace pilot Char Aznavour infiltrates a Federation base and steals a powerful prototype mobile suit, the Gundam. Using this cutting-edge machine, Char leads his allies to a key victory. But during the mission, a mysterious accident involving the Gundam's experimental tech causes Char and his iconic red mobile suit to vanish without a trace. 6 years pass. Although the war officially ended, scattered battles still flare across space. On a quiet colony, a teenage girl named Amate Mashu lives a mundane life with her mother. While her peers are buried in endless cram school prep, Mashu dreams of something more, something thrilling. Her wish is answered when the Gundam GQuuuuuuX, a next-gen Zeon mobile suit, crashes near her home. Drawn to it by instinct, Mashu discovers she can pilot it with remarkable ease, using it to repel attacking Federation forces.
With that out of the way, I actually want to talk about something I find pretty interesting first, and that is the work of the director of Gundam GQuuuuuuX, because it's interesting. He started off at Studio Gainax, so he's been involved with two Gainax properties. One kind of infamously, one that I just found out by going through his filmography. But he's been involved with other things too, like Kill la Kill. So clearly he moved on to Trigger at some point. But he's been involved with two kind of like Gainax cult classics, even more than say something as kind of transformative as Evangelion. Although I remember him, I know for a fact he also worked on Evangelion, just not in a directorial capacity. He worked in a directorial capacity, though, on very specifically Kare Kano, which is His and Her Circumstances, if you've never heard of it. It is a kind of awesome and fun as hell and really interesting and introspective teenage rom-com that runs the full gambit of it's not just about will they, won't they. Eventually they do very early on in the show, and by the end of that show, spoiler alerts for basically everything we're going to talk about here, by the way, the characters actually are on the verge of going their separate ways, and the characters are kind of okay with that on some level, which is a really interesting way to deal with a romance story that you don't see a whole lot of, even in live action. Most people are really interested in what, like, the getting together and the will they, won't they, and, like, the in-romance stuff. It's not necessarily always the, or almost never that I've seen, is the we're growing apart stuff, which is, they start to get into it in the show, and then they kind of run aground with the end of that series, but you can always go continue it in the Kare Kano manga, of which I knew somebody in college who was a Korean transfer student, had the entirety of that manga in Korean. It was very funny to me. But the other show that you probably know Kazuya Tsurumaki from is FLCL. And the thing here with FLCL is that it now has, as I've come to understand, although I knew this in my bones, I just didn't remember, it has count them, 4 sequel series. None of the sequel series, and the reason why I'm saying 4 direct sequels is because none of them connect to each other, but they all connect to the original FLCL. They're all like alternate universe continuations. And they're all also pretty universally bad, which is not good. And they're like taken as being bad for the most part. You know, FLCL Tsuge, FLCL, Grunge, FLCL, like the 4 of them. And those were kind of made, in hindsight, they were made as kind of weird cash grabs. But the practical problem with this is if you go to watch FLCL on the place it should be, which is Crunchyroll, because Crunchyroll bought Funimation, and for the longest time FLCL was on Funimation. And although I think FLCL started on a now defunct thing, because the DVDs I have are from a now defunct anime distributor. I don't remember who. But if you want to watch it streaming, it's gotten a lot harder because they have the 4 sequel series, but they don't have the original FLCL up. I'm sure you can go find it. I'm sure it's not that hard. It's a 6-episode thing. It's absolutely infamous. But I found it really interesting that the show we're about to talk about is directed by the same person who directed FLCL. It is on Amazon Prime. It's not on Crunchyroll at all, I'm pretty sure. And its kind of nearest kind of spiritual relative, I would think, is FLCL, and the original FLCL is not available in streaming form legally, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but at the time of recording this, I can't think of where it would be. And that struck me as really kind of a dropped ball, because you have this show that feels very much, and I'll get into it a little later, but you have this show that feels very much like a show that's already out, a show that everybody that is infamous for, especially old taku of my age, but also for otaku, for otaku in general. It's a kind of infamously sought after show, in the same vein kind of as something like what's it called? What's the Satoshi Kon show? It drives me nuts. But the Satoshi Kon show that had to be licensed rescued. It was Robin Williams' favorite anime. I forget the name right now. I'm driving me crazy. It has that great techno opening. I can remember literally everything but the name. But anyway, so it has that kind of appeal. Paranoia Agent is what I was thinking of. Paranoia Agent is it has that same kind of cult quality thing as Paranoia Agent, but the difference is that it was available for a lot longer, and therefore it was you could just get at it for longer. It was just a thing that was around in a way that was much more specific than, say, your average that was much more specific than something like Paranoia Agent, where for many years Paranoia Agent was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, because the people who had seen it kept preaching about it, like me, and kept going to find it and like being like, I can have this for free because nobody will license this thing for whatever weird reason. And whereas FLCL was always available to purchase in some form. I'm sure you can still purchase the DVDs. I don't know that it's out of print, but it might be. Well, not the DVDs, but the Blu-ray. Eventually, they even made it easier on the manga side because they compiled both manga volumes into one omnibus. You could go out and just buy one book and have it all, which is both really nice and made me really sad when I found that out, because I'm like, oh, having those two books is like is like a very specific experience. But I understand that, like, with the pillows and like the music rights and all that stuff, it probably got very complicated, but it just seems like a drop ball to me on Crunchyroll's end to not have the original FLCL and only specifically have the kind of, once again, universally derided, from what I understand, and from my experience of attempting to watch them, for sequel series that they kind of dumped into the world. It turned out unceremoniously because you watch them and they feel like cash grabs. They don't have the same soul as the kind of grind punkness of the original FLCL. And the reason why I'm talking so much about this, and the reason why I'm harping on this, is because you can feel the kind of FLCL as a reference point to how the characters act in this show. And reference points are a big deal in this show in general, because this show deeply celebrates the history of Gundam. And in fact, it is, by the way, spoilers for all of Gundam, for all 12 episodes of Gundam GQuuuuuuX. It is a alternate retelling of the original Gundam. It is like not even an alternate retelling. It is a alternate future for Gundam. And the reason why I'm saying that is because in the original Gundam event timeline, in the end, what's called the UC timeline, which is the Universal Century timeline, we'll get back to that in a second. The Federation wins the war, and there's a colony drop, and a colony is dropped on Earth, and Zeon ends up being defeated I believe it's questionable whether or not Char Aznable is killed. I hate pronouncing his last name; it always tripped me up. But mostly because later on in the Gundam like Universal Century timeline, UC timeline, he actually there's a character named Full Frontal who wears a mask and he looks like he's eaten every hot dog on one side of the universe, and everybody seems to suggest that maybe that guy's just Char in a mask, which is entirely possible considering Gundam chronology and nonsense. But the thing about this show that's really interesting is and everybody was all over social media saying that you had to, in fact, like watch all these Gundam shows kind of as homework to catch yourself up. And granted, I have a lot of Gundam experience. I've seen almost without trying entirely more Gundam than you would expect. Like I've seen the original show, I've seen the one where they play nuclear football. I'm not kidding. I've seen Iron Blooded Orphans multiple times. I've seen a bunch of like both Universal Century things and what's called alternate universe or AU things. And it's true, if you have seen a fair bit of Gundam, this show will give you more. Now, I don't have certain very specific details that lots of other like serious hardcore mecha anime, Gundam fans have, but I certainly had enough to go into the show and be like, oh, that's cool. And the thing I really like about the show is that it does try not to lean too heavily on that. And that's important because yes, you can make a show that's really referential and is all in its field about the original Gundam, and this entire show, you watch it and you're like, and I say this with love as a nerd, this thing was made by a bunch of anime nerds. And there's no two ways about it. Like, from the kind of vibe of the show, and this show has a lot of that grind punk FLCL vibe. Eventually, I actually have a note in my notes that says, Shuji feels like a character who comes up in the show named Shuji feels like an Ava character filtered through FLCL, which is a wild thing. Like, he feels like almost like a Ava pilot, the one that shows up at the end, who's also an angel. I forget his name, the white-haired one. Filtered through an FLCL lens and then dropped into a Gundam show, which is definitely not on my bingo card for 2025. But that lack of requiring you to know a ton about the original Gundam, but also giving you the stuff you need to understand the significance in the show. And eventually the show just kind of drops all pretenses and says, oh, this is an alternate universe. Here's what happened in the original universe. And it just spells it out for you. But that's in the last episode, or maybe last two episodes of the show. But fairly early on, they show you the point at which the timeline fully diverges. And that is where Rei Amuro should get the Gundam. Eventually, Char happens on the Gundam and steals it, essentially. And they do the Char Aznable thing of painting the Gundam red, and kind of the thing I'm most perplexed about in this show is the mecha design. And I understand it's Studio Khara, they have a very specific design ethos. Even like even the Avas feel a lot different from the original Ava design in the original show, in the like You Cannot series, in the new movies, the like You Cannot movies that came out of Studio Khara, which are very good. I'm not going to say that they're not, but they have a very specific design look that's not necessarily for everybody, but it's an opinion. I will certainly say that they tend to make mecha designs that are much more overbuilt, and this is, I'm not saying any of this is like as a critique of the style. I'm just saying this is like the best way I can describe it. They feel more overbuilt and complex than many mecha designs out right now, or out at all. So you get these kind of like very complicated looking mecha, and out of giant robots out of this studio. And the Gundam Klux is no exception. The Gundam Klux does not look like a Gundam. I'm not saying that it isn't. They call it one. It like has a version of the headdress, but it really looks like kind of like an alternate universe Gundam, which makes the treatment of the original RX-79 in the, or RX-78, sorry, RX-78. 79 is a different model, I'm pretty sure. But the RX-78 when you first see it in the show as being this like completely painted red Gundam, feels very odd because you're used to that kind of like red, white, and blue Federation coded red, white, blue, and yellow or gold Federation coded Gundam look. That look is really iconic, and I understand why they wanted to break that for the audience, because it was something they could break and play with, but it just doesn't. The kind of solid red look of the Gundam of the RX-78 that you see in the series at first just doesn't play as well as the original Gundam color scheme, because it's the exact same design, just like doused in red paint. And they do it because it was originally Char's mobile suit in the alternate timeline and in the alternate universe split off. But it feel and I didn't really think about this until the very end of the show, when when they actually show you Char's Zaku, when they actually animate Char's Zaku, and in some like alternate universe like dream sequence things, or like peering dream sequence things, the Zaku feels like it the Char's red Zaku feels like it's designed to be the colors it is. It feels like they were the person who designed those mechs, and I'm not an expert at this, so I'm not sure, designed the Zaku, Char's Zaku, to be that color every time. The Gundam feels off, and I'm sure that's actually probably for a reason. It's supposed to give you a tip of like, this is not normal. Like, this is not, like, this machine was never made to be this, which is a really interesting thing. But like I said, I want to get back to kind of the FLCL vibe of this show. This show has like a very emotional underpinning to its arc. The characters of the kind of two main characters of Nyan and has her listed as Amate in the on my anime list, but I watched it dubbed, and I don't believe that was what it was supposed to be. So hold on, I want to find her. I want to find her actual character name. But anyway, those two characters, they feel almost like no, it's supposed to be Amate here too. Feel almost like they are an FLCL answer to what it looks like to make what's his face, the main character, Naota, for a female audience. What I mean there is they're very in their fields. They have a lot of like interpersonal between each other and other characters issues that are very much like this is their first time encountering this stuff. They're growing into their own skin, and by the end of the show, they really show like these two are now like they've got their heads screwed on straight finally. But for most of the show, at first it's just Amate, but it's also Nyan later. Feel very malleable and feel very kind of fungible in the way that like young girls going through puberty are. They feel very impressionable. And you meet these characters who like want to impress on them on some level. And it becomes this like very specific and weird relationship between the two of them, because you have Amate, who is born on the colony and had never been to Earth, and is born essentially immediately as a citizen of Xi'an. And then you have Nyan, who came up as a refugee, who came up as a war refugee. And you're meant to understand that the war that takes place in the original Gundam ended only recently, and everything's a little weird and dicey. But Xi'an is technically in control, and there's like all kinds of characters that you meet who are not happy about that and all this stuff. But here, now we have that kind of base set of like, there's a very FLCL coded show in terms of its emotional like vibe set. I want to talk a little bit about the plot, even though I know there was a plot synopsis, which was very useful, because I think the show could have used some more time in the oven. And that's because the show starts with like deep military stuff, and then the Gundam clock's basically being locked by Chayabol's like unit to a bunch of underground street like mobile suit street fighting kids, and it ends up being piloted by Amate in what they call in the show clan battles, which are basically Gundam versions of row battles from Metabots, except people die eventually. And then like 2 or 3 of these go by, and they start messing with the formula a bit, and at that point they also introduce Shuji, who is important for later. But after a couple of these go by, and Amate and Shuji are fighting and winning, they introduce a character, I forget her name, who is you can, if you see her, and you've seen old Gundam, you recognize her as like, oh, she's a character from the original Gundam timeline, but she's filtered through this kind of like AU filter And she's the first part of the show where it starts to, where like the FLCL-ness starts to fall away and starts to kind of unwind in a bad way. Because up until now, you have, characters fighting, in these clan battles, which are big illegal mobile suit fights. And Shuji and Amate win, but they never kill anybody because they never need to. And then you encounter this character, and all of a sudden, they need to, and it's like flipping a switch. In a way that's like really unnerving. And that kind of lets you know what you're about to be in for, because they don't and actually the character name is Shiko, and they don't really know how to like make that transition. And this is only a 12-episode show. There's like a 13th episode special thing, but not really an episode. It's more like an introductory thing to the show. But with only 12, the thing about FLCL is like its main story is about it's like built on vibes, and it's about kind of a coming of age thing. It's about like what it looks like when all the adults in your life are dickbags. Like it's about a very specific vibe more than it is a story, and the story is kind of sci-fi nonsense. I mean, I'm sure there's stuff there, but it doesn't. But the story of that show doesn't matter. What matters is the interiority of the characters. Here, they're telling this story over twice as long, and they're doing it with a very specific property. And the story has to be able to expand to fit the size it needs to fit. And after watching all 12 episodes, it feels like there needs to be more episodes in there. It feels like it needs to stretch, like the show needs to stretch itself out more, so you have more time to make that transition. So you have more time to build the kind of manipulative relationships that Amate and Nyan get into. Because Nyan eventually is kind of... You see her agreeing to Kazuya Zabi's like kind of framework of saying like we'll send you a really good Zeon Academy. You'll finally be free, and you'll have like status and all this stuff. You and your family won't have to struggle, and like that's a very clear motivation at that point in the show for Nyan. But then it kind of like jumps to her being like ride or die for Kazuya. And Kazuya is proven to be kind of a dickbag. Like, Chalia Bowl, say what you want about him, but he's certainly manipulative. But he has this kind of like kindness to him, and he has this kind of like, I'm gonna do it to you without you knowing, caring, or suffering from it, unless you're directly on the opposite side of me. And Kazuya is very plainly using people like chess pieces. And that they don't give you an amount of time to sit with Kazuya and Nyan's relationship where it really feels like it fully fleshes out, and you understand like why Nyan is so like focused on Kazuya. Because essentially all Kazuya has done is like made a bunch of like promises that may or may not come true if Nyan lives to see them being granted. And you also mix in all of this conversation about Newtypes, which I think... So, and I've thought about this like weirdly as a problem for a little bit now, but the idea of Newtypes in Gundam, which if you don't know anything about Newtypes in Gundam, this this you can still watch this show. It'll just be a little weird for you. But essentially, Newtypes are like humans with this latent psychic ability that allows them to use technology, specifically pilot mobile suits, at a really high level. But the problem with Newtypes as like a race of people is that they are never divorced from the military machine of most Gundam shows. In most every Gundam show, when you encounter a Newtype, it's not like they're just hanging out. They're piloting a mobile suit and like in conflicts all the time. And part of that is because all like Gundam shows make a point of being like, oh, these kids were like scooped up and made to do this. But the other part of it is really like, it feels like the concepts of Newtypes revolve around the violence of war and the military. And you don't often, at least I haven't often seen them like applied to things outside of the military. The only one who I can really think of is Hallelujah Baptism, who I would imagine is probably a Newtype. It is, I think, explicitly a Newtype. Maybe an engineered Newtype, actually. In Gundam 00, when eventually he just, like, says screw it, fucks off, and goes hiking with his other Newtype girlfriend. Like, it's wild. And that is so posed as a happy ending for him in the Gundam 00 universe. Because it's like, oh, freaking, what's his face gets to not fight again. Hallelujah Baptism gets to not have to fight again, ever. This is an unequivocated win. Everything rules for Hallelujah Baptism. We're just happy about it. But otherwise, every time you encounter Newtypes in Gundam, you're encountering them in the context of war. And so this, like, ultimate stated goal of Chalia Bol, of, like, helping Newtypes to be the kind of, like, next step of human evolution, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And there's this, like, old non-psychically connected humans are the past, and like new psychically connected humans are the present. And between Nyan and Amate, there's a suggestion that there are a lot of Newtypes now in the world who just are not being recognized because they're not just stepping into a mobile suit the way that, say, Amuro Rated or in some people's consideration, Char Admirable did, or Chalia Bol does. The way that I find the judgment of Newtypes to be kind of flawed in a key way that doesn't help this show's premise work its way through the world. And I do think the show sticks the landing, but I think that the show, like I said, could have had a couple, at the very least, a couple more episodes. At the very most, it could have doubled its length and had the time to, like, make the transition from one part of what the show wants to do to the next part without feeling so disjointed, without having to force it so quickly. And I don't know what kind of like episode order this show could have had or what they were committed to or any of that. I don't even know if there's going to be another season, but they did tell a full story. And it just doesn't. And I don't think it's a bad show. I actually wish that this was available more widely because I get this distinct sense that most people are not watching it. because it's on Amazon Prime, and that happens with a lot of shows. It's just they get bought up by Amazon Prime, which this one makes sense because Studio Khara notoriously gave the license to the Ava movies in America, and I believe Canada, to Amazon Prime. I'm not sure why they did that, but they did that, and so it makes sense that the Gundam GQuuuuuuX show is on Prime instead of anywhere else, because there is that licensing relationship history there. But I do wish, like I said, I do wish this show had gone wider in a real way. I think it still probably could. I think that a lot of people who have seen this show will start to sing its praises now that we're winding out of the spring season for 2025. I know it was a big reason of why I wanted to do this specific episode. The reason I'm doing it now is specifically, I'm not kidding, because I went to go find FLCL on Crunchyroll, and the original FLCL, the 6 episodes, were just not there. They were just not there. And I was so incensed. I'm like, I'm doing this thing out of spite. I'm talking specifically about FLCL not being on the platform at the beginning of this, which is what I did. So, you have this interesting thing with Gundam GQuuuuuuX that is, it's very referential to the rest of the Gundam, to the original Gundam timeline and shows. To such a point that by the end of the show, it is showing you clips from the original Gundam series. But you also have a show that wants to be and do its own thing. So you have this kind of like odd mix of these characters having the same advantage and disadvantages of something like Iron-Blooded Orphans. The trick they pull off with Iron-Blooded Orphans is they fling that show so far into the future that it's like 400 years since the last major conflict in the greater world of space. And it's kind of suggested that, like, if the original Gundam Mobile Suit Gundam show from 1979 or 1989 is or 70s and or 70s or 80s. I'm gonna make that pretty vague there. Is the beginning of the Gundam timeline. Iron-Blooded Orphans might be near the end, or much closer to the end than it is the beginning. So what they do in Iron-Blooded Orphans is they kind of like muddy the water enough where it could fit into the UC timeline, but it doesn't need to. And it also makes a great advancement of what that conflict could morph into, of what the like Earth versus the Federation and Earth forces versus the space noids could turn into in the future. But this show has to be a like what if scenario, because by definition that's what it is. But it's like they set it up but weren't satisfied in the middle there with it just being a story about teenagers and their feelings with giant robots. And they had to pull a lot of like odd story beats to make it fit. I think ultimately it does fit. I think at the very least there are some absolutely fantastic visuals out of the whole damn show. But it could have been a little bit more. And the part of me that said that you can watch this without watching Gundam, without watching any of the other Gundams, also knows that the majority of people who are talking about who will be talking about this show will not be talking about it from that angle. I'm talking about it from that angle because I want to do that. I don't want to like sit here and exhaustively go through all the references and all that stuff. Like I said, Kazuya is an original like Gundam Xeon villain. She I think her name's Shika is also an original like Gundam character from the Federation side, who they use the kind of like they use the alternate universe loss of the Federation to like make her into like an especially cruel and mean antagonist for an episode or two. But I just think that there was a more elegant way they could have pulled off that transition from we're a bunch of punk kids fighting for doing giant robot fights for money to we're all in mobile suits in the middle of outer space, kind of in tiny wars, like almost starting another great war kind of thing. And I don't, and like I said, a lot of people talking about the show will be talking about it from the kind of historical, this is a show that is built on references to the original property, and that is very true. But I think there's a way to do this show, and it decouple itself a little bit from those references, and for a little while, and still be just as good. Because I think the opening of the show is excellent. It captures you immediately. When you're introduced to Amate, and she's kind of this listless, almost Naota, almost what's his face from what's it called, from Eureka 7, kind of listless teenager who's just kind of floating through life and doesn't really know what's out there for her. And you're introduced to Nyan, who's like working as an underground illegal kind of like delivery person. And the end of the show where you have them briefly on opposite sides because they've been manipulated by the adults in their lives to be there. And then they very quickly are like, no, everybody's trying to kill everybody. This is dumb. We should do what we think we should do together. I think those both ends are pretty fantastic. It's the middle part where like the transition between those two gets lost because it just doesn't have enough time that bothers me. And you also get characters who, as normal for characters to fall away over time, but you get characters like Amate and eventually Nyan's whole crew of clan battle like buddies who fall away because like the show almost doesn't know how to keep them linked together. And once that happens, you lose all of this you lose a certain amount of that like awesome FLCL like kids hanging out vibe that is in this show. So there's a great there's a great episode of FLCL, I think it's called Brittle Bullet, where they are straight up like playing paintball by the river. And there's so many of the characters in that show, so many of Naota's friends that feel like they have spiritually traveled into this show. There's and there's also a character named Anki who clearly has a history with probably the Federation and has some feelings about Xeon, and they use her as a character to a point, and then she's just not in the show anymore. I think there's a lot of I think what probably bugs me the most about the show, and once again, I think this is a really good show. I rate it 4 stars. I think it's a great thing. But the thing that bugs me the most about the show is that in the middle, as a necessity to hop, skip, and jump to where they need to be for the end of the show, they leave a ton of loose threads that could have been really interesting, cool things. Like, what does Anki and her, like, clan battle crew look like when they're thrown into the same melting pot with, Cassilia and with Chaya and with Char and that whole bigger universe? One of the best things that, and this is probably where I'm going to end it, but one of the best things that Iron Blood Orphans does is it says, look at this very cloistered group of kids who are being exploited for labor and, like, exist in their own little hellscape of a world. And then it drags them into the kind of interplanetary giant scale of conflict, and it situates them in a way that they become this big part of it. And if you take a character like Anki or any of the other characters who are in the clan battle, like, part of the show, and you kind of pull them into the Shaya Bowl, like, crew, that could look like a very different show, and you have a lot more playing pieces on the board to mess with. And I'm only going through this right now thinking about it, but it stands out. It really stands out that, like, they just let those characters fall away entirely. You see the clan battle crew at the very end of the show, but it's very clear that, like, we're just touching base here. Like, they're not something that we ever even really felt like we needed to focus on again. And that seems like a shame, because that part of the show is really fun and interesting, and it's this really, like, weird application of Gundam that other than something like G Gundam, which in G Gundam, if you've never seen it, they have essentially kind of a clan battle thing, but they don't. But it's all officially sanctioned, and Earth is set up as basically a giant Thunderdome. Much to Earth's dismay and all the people who live there. And actually, this is where I want to stop here. The kind of, like, big issue with Gundam is, until fairly recently, is that Gundam never kind of wrestles with its main message other than to tell you war is bad, but then it immediately says, but look at all this cool war. And the reason why I say that until recently is, if you watch Gundam Hathaway, which I encourage you to go watch Gundam Hathaway, the thing is beautiful. Just shut up and watch Gundam Hathaway. It is gorgeous. Even if that's the only reason you watch it, go watch Gundam Hathaway. But in that film, it's one of the places where they show you how terrifying mobile suits are from, like, a ground perspective. And it's kind of the first time I've ever seen them really do this. And, like, how horrifying it is. Even if you know that it's on your side, it's still terrifying to, like, be walking back to your hotel, and just a giant foot the size of, like, 5 city buses just crashes down anywhere close to you. That's, like, PTSD for life. And Gundam Hathaway gets that really right, and it levels with that, and Hathaway, the main character, like, says it much in the movie, if I remember. The other place they do this is the CGI Zeon thing, which I haven't seen all of, in which you're on the side of Zeon, and, like, you have all these characters witnessing a Gundam show up for the first time ever, and they're just like, what the fuck is that thing? And they call it a white demon. And in the show, it's referred to as a white demon on the Zeon side a lot, but you never really get that sense because it's said kind of like a nickname that's given by the enemy faction. In the Zeon thing that's actually on Netflix, it carries a lot more weight because you're sitting with these characters who are in fiction the bad guy, but that story treats as your protagonist, and they're all like, it was fine. It was fine. We weren't doing great, but it was fine. And then that white nightmare shows up and murders everyone I've ever known. Like those two kind of moments and those two things demonstrate the kind of like violence that's occurring here, and they ground the violence in a way that, like, I understand why Gundam is oftentimes unwilling to, but really should more often. And there's actually a lot more of that now that I think about it in G Gundam, but it's played with much more still butt rock 90s heck yeah-ness than it is in Gundam Hathaway or in the, I forget the name of the Zeon thing on Netflix, but you type in Gundam in Netflix and it'll come up. But this show does that too, pretty quickly, because up until a certain point in the show, actually kind of a turning point episode in the show, kind of halfway through, you're always seeing the Gundams fight in space. Actually, with the exception of the first episode and the sixth episode, you're always seeing the Gundams fight in space. And in the first episode, the Gundam GQuuuuuuX crashes into the colony and they have to patch it up. But it's a big deal. It's like not a small thing. Like a giant robot fell into the colony. That's a nightmare thing. In the sixth episode, I think it's called, and actually the way they refer to it in the English dub is Mashu. I think it's called Mashu's Revenge. And the main character, Mashu, is plotting to like leave and go find Shuji because Shuji has disappeared. But, plotting to get Shuji and Nyan and leave because they're all very clearly like in danger of being pulled into like a much more complicated nightmare thing. But they essentially detonate a bomb in the middle of the colony. Like there is like real meaningful physical and nightmarish violence in the colony in a way that's like earth moving, not real earth notwithstanding, for the kind of like greater world and setting of the show. And the show kind of never forgets about that until the end. And even in the end, it never forgets about that. It's always pretty aware of kind of like the core violence there because it's put it on the screen in a way that's also true of, once again, that Zeon thing and of Gundam Hathaway. Gundam Hathaway is so aware of kind of the effect that the kind of high-level mobile suit fights are having on the rest of humanity that it causes Hathaway to kind of exist as a character. More or less. But on that note, this is where I'm going to leave it. I hope I gave you a bunch of reasons to go find this show. If you have an Amazon Prime subscription, you can just go watch this. It's got commercials in it, but it's also entirely dubbed, which is really nice. Part of the reason why I couldn't remember Amate's name or I didn't know Amate's name was because she's actually referred to as Mashu in the entirety of the dub. I don't know why they made that choice, but they do call her Mashu for the whole dub. But which is weird because nobody else's character name is changed. Like even new characters like Nyan still have the same name, but Amate they're just like nope, Mashu. but definitely go check it out on Amazon Prime if you have an opportunity to. It's worth your time, especially if you like things like FLCL. I can't stress this enough. At many points watching this show, I thought to myself, so is it just FLCL plus Gundam for girls? Like, what's happening here? And that's very similar to the previous Gundam show that came out, the kind of previous big AU Gundam show that came out in this kind of vein, which is the one with the aerial Gundam. Oh God, what is it? Witch from Mercury. Witch from Mercury also has some of these vibes because it is so high school focused for so long, and I actually think it has a lot of the same story transition issues. But on that note, I am going to leave it here. So if you like the show, be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the bell underneath the video so you can know when new episodes drop on YouTube. But I will see you guys next time.